Buenas noches. Hablo poco de español, but I will be speaking in English, and Fabian will be translating, so thank you very much for your support on that. Today I want to try to do a practical philosophy talk. Philosophy has a reputation for being very abstract, and it can be, but all of those abstractions, when translated into practice, make life and death differences. And so the impact of abstract philosophical ideas on political practice is my theme. And what I want to do today really is make 2 points. I'll telegraph them at the beginning. The first one is philosophy, and culture are more important than politics. Obviously, politics matters crucially. Politics can kill people. Politics can make people's lives miserable. Politics can also open up a space in which people can flourish and survive and put together wonderful lives. But politics depends on broader culture, and it depends on philosophy, and that's the point that I want to make first. In philosophy and culture, probably the most significant issue, particularly for younger people who become the leaders, the parents, the teachers, and administrators of the next generation, is when they are young, who their heroes are. Now, ethics as a branch of philosophy is about the meaning of life, what is good, what is bad, what's important, what's not important, what is significant. And as thoughtful human beings, we are always engaged with questions about our lives. Like, what are we going to do with our lives? But those issues are very abstract, and one way we concretize or bring down to earth, particularly when we are young, is in the form of the people we look up to. Right? We look up to movie stars because they stand for a certain kind of lifestyle, or sports heroes. Typically, when we become older, we start to admire people in professions, perhaps policemen, right, or people in business, or teachers, and so on. But different cultures have different kinds of heroes, different kinds of role models whom they uphold for young people. And depending on the kinds of heroes who are upheld and promoted, cultures go in very different directions. So what I want to do today is, before we plunge into my argument for why we should see entrepreneurs as heroes, as cultural heroes, and work to promote entrepreneurship, I want to pause and make a little historical point, because I know Argentina is going through turbulent political times, and that focuses our attention on the short term. In the United States, we also have serious short-term political problems, right, and so forth. But for all of the problems and for all of the reasons why it's easy to be depressed, cynical, and of course there's a lot to be depressed about, there's a lot to be cynical about. Nonetheless, there also is a lot of good news, and there is a lot of grounds for optimism. So I want to start with a chart. This is one of my favorite charts. One of the beautiful things that has happened in the intellectual world over the course of the last generation has been the rise of computer power, enabling scientists, social scientists, and people in the humanities to crunch or put together all sorts of data that when I was a student going through was unimaginable. We used to have to make qualitative arguments about various things. Now we can make quantitative arguments, and they can be displayed in beautiful form. So I want to just dwell on this chart for a moment. Along the bottom here is time. So we go back to the year 0. Rome is in transition from being a republic to becoming its imperial era. It's straddling the life of Jesus Christ, significant to the Western religious traditions. Then we go 500 years, Rome declines. 1,000 years, Europe is in its dark ages. Another 500 years, the Renaissance and Reformation are underway, and then approximately now. So that's 2,000 years of our history. Up the vertical axis here is world population. And what we see is that if we go to around the year 0, there were perhaps 200 million people living in the entire world. Right? And then now the world population is pushing 7 billion. So significant number of increasing people right over time. But it's these green dots that I want to focus on, because what those are the best social scientists' estimates of gross domestic product. That is an average, the amount of productivity per person right in the world. And this is the whole world that is averaged. So what we see 2,000 years ago, the world average, the average person is producing $467 right, worth of value every year. And you can only consume what you produce. That number, 1,000 years later, is essentially the same. No progress. Right? You jump another 500 years, there has been 20% improvement, and that is a significant improvement. But if we were to take this line and go back another 1,000 years, another 2,000 years, that line has been flat for almost as long as human beings have been around. But then notice what happens starting in 1600, in 1700, and then unbelievably, in the last 150 years, that line goes almost vertical. That has never happened before in human history. Unbelievable material prosperity has been achieved in the last 200 years. Now, the big question then is, why did that happen? Why in the last 200 years? And not for the many tens of thousands of years of human history? And then a follow-up question, because that did not happen in all countries equally around the world. Many countries around the world are still at this level here. They have not changed from where they have been for thousands and thousands of years. And actually, if you take Argentina, right, Argentina is approximately up here. And if you take the wealthiest countries in the world, like Hong Kong and Singapore, we are way up on the roof, right, because their gross domestic product is in the $40,000 and $50,000. So why did it happen in the last 200 years, and why did it happen in the countries that it happened? Right? That is the most important question, in my judgment, for modern times. Understanding that we have achieved something, why we achieved it, and figuring that out so that in the next generation, right, when we pass things off to our children, we give them the knowledge that they can continue to build, right, and progress. All right, here's my next chart. Now here is one of the explanations for why. This is, if you go along the horizontal axis here, this is a measure of the degree of economic freedom, right, in a given country. And each yellow diamond is a particular country, right, in the world. So there's 100 and something of those measuring different countries. And what social scientists will do is, when they study business, is the various dimensions of economic freedom. How free are people to go into whatever business they choose? Are there price controls, or are people able to negotiate whatever prices they want? How free are people to export and import goods? How free are people to exit businesses and go into other businesses? How long does it take to get a license to open your business, to produce a good, various good, and so on? Many dimensions and so on. They crunch all of that, and the most economically free countries then get a higher score. The least economically free countries get a low score. On the vertical axis, we plot the country's wealth, and this is, again, gross domestic product, right, per capita. And then you do the averaging and you get a correlation like this. And so one of the lessons then is, the more economically free your country is, the more prosperous it is. And without exception, the countries that are not economically free are poor. Now, all of this is anonymous. We don't know from this chart which countries are where, but we can make some good educated guesses. Now, I want to do another little historical lesson. These are very abstract statistics that I've thrown out so far. But just go back to 1836, which I know is early in Argentina's history. I'm originally from Canada. Canada wasn't a country yet. It happens for another 30 years. The United States is still a young country, right? It's in a couple of generations, right, or so. But nonetheless, we're significantly into the modern world by the time we get to 1836. The richest man in the world, I don't know if you know him. What's actually interesting about this is that this was the first time in the 1800s when the richest man in the world is not a king or an aristocrat. The richest man in the world is a businessman. Right? And that's an indication of modern times, that wealth is being produced by people in business, not being acquired through political means of conquest and taxation and expropriation. The richest man, I'm going to keep that as a mystery just for one more minute. This datum here, life expectancy at birth, was 38 years less. A little bit over if you're female, a little bit under if you are male. Now that's a scary number to us, but that is the historical norm for all of human history. And again, in the most desperately poor parts of the world right now, life expectancy still is in the high 30s. All right, now the richest man in the world, make your own private guesses. The answer is right, Nathan Rothschild. Right? He is the guy who built up his father's small bank into the international banking powerhouse right, that it was. In 1836, he's in his late 50s, so he's beat the historical average. He's living a good life in London, England, right, running the banking fortune. And at the beginning of 1836, he has his doctors come and give him a medical checkup. He is pronounced as being in excellent health for a man of his age, except for being overweight, but he likes to eat and drink, so he has no plans to change that part of his life. Nonetheless, a few months later, he calls his doctors back because in his lower back he's gotten a pain. He thinks he had a boil or some sort of abscess and it's been bothering him, and his doctors poke at it and prod at it and they do the best they can, but he gets worse. And then a couple of months later, as he's going downhill, they bring in specialists from Germany, which is becoming a leading scientific and medical institution. They can't do anything for him, and by the end of the summer, he is dead at age 59. Right. Why did he die? Right. And then medical forensics in the 20th century right, goes back and they figure out right, from the doctor's notes and so on. It turns out that what he died of was simple blood poisoning. That he did have a boil right, with pus in his lower back. Whatever prodding they did with sharp instruments introduced some of the bacteria, except they didn't know about bacteria, they didn't know about germs, this is still before that revolution, into his bloodstream. It multiplied rapidly and he died right, of blood poisoning. And one measure of how much progress we have made is that we now know that if he had had about 12 of these pills, antibiotics pills, he would have lived. And the point is that in 1836, the richest man in the world, in the richest country in the world, could not get his hands on these pills to save his life. Because the medicine wasn't there, the science wasn't there, right? And we, however, in the 20th century and in the 20th century, we take this sort of thing for granted. Right? Nobody dies of blood poisoning right, in the United States. Nobody who needs to get antibiotics in most of the developed world, no matter how desperately poor they are, doesn't get the antibiotics right, that they need. They are cheap, and when we ask why they are cheap, that's also an important question to understand why they are cheap, because we have built up a magnificent medical establishment behind that, a magnificent scientific and technological research establishment. All of those things are extraordinarily expensive and require vast amounts of money. We have built up an economy that is able to support these magnificent scientific and research medical right, establishments, to the point that average life expectancy for us right, in the United States, this is just in my lifetime, I was born in 1960, has gone from 70 to 78. But that is more than double the life expectancy of the average person living in the United States a century and a half ago. So one measure of how prosperous we are is not necessarily even monetary, but the fact that we get twice as much life on average compared to most people throughout most of human history. And this applies to rich people as well as poor people. The Argentine numbers, here they are. Argentina starting at about 65, it's now up to around 76. That's also significant progress right in my life. And most of the developed world right, has followed this trend as well. There are exceptions. One of the sad exceptions is Zimbabwe. Starting in the early 1960s, life expectancy was in the low 50s. It was following the trend line that the rest of the world was following until 1987. And what happened in 1987? Dictatorship. Mugabe right, comes to power, he consolidates power, he becomes a dictatorship, and bad things start to happen. Right? So politics can undo and destroy the vast progress that's been made in the other elements right, of culture and so on. Now again, those are fairly abstract statistics, and what I like to do is individualize these things, to say that we are talking about real human beings, and in the modern world, the kind of cultures that we have created have made life and death differences for not just thousands of individuals, but millions and millions of individuals. The people who generously introduced me mentioned my Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship. One of the things that I like to do is interview entrepreneurs in various different fields with very interesting stories, and to try to figure out what makes these entrepreneurs tick, right, and so on, so I can teach my students, and so on. This is a younger woman whom I interviewed in California, and she has a fascinating story. And I'll just tell you the 2-minute story here. She was born in India, and her father was in the army, which means basically she was an army brat on all of these bases all over India. She did pretty well in school, and she went to university. She was the first woman in a group of 3 women out of 300 male students to enter an engineering university in India, right, and she graduated. And when she was at university, she met a young man, they fell in love, they wanted to get married. But then when she graduated, she faced 2 problems. One problem was that she was a woman with an engineering degree, and in India, she wasn't going to get a job in engineering. Right? So she was not going to be able to pursue the career that she wanted to do. Also, the young man that she had fallen in love with was from a different caste in Indian society, and there was enormous pressure and discomfort from both sides of the family about the prospect of those 2 getting married. So what did she do? She and the man she was in love with, they look around the world and they say, where can we go to put together the kind of life that we want to live? And so they decided the United States. They could have chosen Australia or England or Canada, but they chose the United States. And they came to the United States. She went into engineering. She moved eventually to Silicon Valley, started a marketing consulting firm, and worked with startups. And they are married, raising their family, and living the good life in California. Now the question I would ask is, and this is the question I ask, what would have happened to her if she had lived in traditional, pre-modern, pre-entrepreneurial cultures? Right? She would not have been able to have the kind of life that she has had. But there are some places in the world that open doors, right, to women like her. And I like this story, but this story happens tens of thousands of times now, and it didn't used to happen. Let me tell you another story. This young man, Francesco Clark, also is an Italian immigrant, but this time from Italy. He ended up coming over here when he was younger, and so he went to college in the United States, and then he was working in publishing, I think. But then one weekend, he was at a party with some friends, and he assures me that no drinking was involved, but nonetheless a horrible accident is about to occur. In the backyard there is a swimming pool, and late in the evening he goes out into the backyard and he dives into the swimming pool. Unfortunately, he dives into the shallow end of the swimming pool, and he hits his chin right on the bottom at almost full force. He was instantly, his spine is severed, and he was instantly then paralyzed from his neck down. For the first 3 months, his doctors told him that he was going to die, all of the experts. He thought that he was going to die. It turned out that he didn't die, but nonetheless, he was extraordinarily depressed, right, as you might expect, thinking his life is over, what am I going to do? He was thinking about suicide. This goes on for almost 2 years. He's not working with his physical therapist. Apparently he has a little bit of movement in his fingers, but he's not doing anything about it. But at the 2-year point, he, as he describes it, gets philosophical. He says, look, I have a choice to make here. I can be depressed. I can give up on my life and say life has given me a crap deal, and I can just vegetate and eventually die having led an insignificant life. Or I can fight. I can see what I can do to put together the most significant possible life that, given the constraints that I have. So he starts to work, and he makes a decision. He's going to try to fight. So he starts to work with his physical therapist. They get a little bit of more movement right in his fingers. they were able to get computer technical people to adapt a keyboard so that with his limited finger movement, he can actually use a keyboard, he can then use a computer, he can interact with the world. And then he becomes an entrepreneur, because one of the things that happened to him when he lost the motor control in the lower half of his body was the